Hello. All right, so we've been talking about tyrants, and now we're going to look specifically at the tyrant who ruled Athens for a period of time, a couple decades. But before we get to that tyrant, we're actually going to look at an attempted and failed tyrant of Athens, and then some measures that Athens took in their attempt to prevent something like a rebellion or a tyranny from happening. That ultimately are not successful. So in this video, we're going to take a look at that early tyrant, or that would-be tyrant, and those attempts, and then we'll do another video where we look at the Pisistratids, which are the family of tyrants which do rule in Athens for a period of time. All right, so we've looked specifically at Athens and what it looked like in this early archaic period. We examined its process of synoikism, how it came together and united Attica in a single political entity. And we talked a bit about its aristocratic government. We said that there's magistrates like the Archon and the Polemarch and so forth. And there's a aristocratic council known as the Areopagus, and that these political positions are dominated by the aristocratic families of Athens, the people known as the Eupatrids. So there's resentment within the city. There's resentment, obviously, from the lower classes. We talked as well about the practices of land renting and debt slavery for when you can't pay your rent. But we also said in the tyranny video that tyrants tend to arise. They take their support from the lower classes and they play off of that resentment. But really, the tyrants aren't really champions of the people as much as they're aristocrats who want to outdo other aristocrats, right? The tyrants often arise as the result of aristocratic infighting amongst families who are vying for more power and more status in the society. And one rises up and again uses that lower class support to drive out the others and take sole power. So the would-be tyrant of Athens is a guy named Cylon. His attempt is dated to 632 BC, and he essentially just tries to take over the city of Athens, right, and make himself tyrant, just like many other men. He doesn't really get his support necessarily from the lower classes. He gets his support from outside. His father-in-law was a man named Theagenes, who was the tyrant of the polis of Megara, and supposedly Theagenes sent mercenaries and men to support Cylon in his endeavor. Despite this, they are ultimately unable to take the city. And we are told that while Cylon got away, his supporters were up on the Acropolis and essentially trapped, right, surrounded by Athenian men who were ready to kill them or drive them out of the city. And they took sanctuary at the sanctuary of Athena on top of the Acropolis, because in the Greek world, if you are in a sanctuary, then you have the protection of the god or goddess. You can't be killed or dragged off or anything like that. Now, these men who are up there taking sanctuary realize they're trapped, right? I mean, they'll starve if they don't leave at some point. So they decide to tie a string to the altar of Athena and to hold on to it as they make their way down the Acropolis. Now, I don't know how long this string was and how far they could have possibly gotten. But this is the story that we're told. And so their claim was, well, we're touching the string's touching the altar, we're still safe. And so they do this while like crowds of Athenian men are watching them, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, the Archon at the time steps in. The Archon at the time belonged to a very powerful and wealthy Athenian family known as the Alcmaeonids. And he looked at this and he said, this is ridiculous. And he pulled out a sword and he cut the string. And then he said, now you can murder them. Now you're safe. It's fine. And so the supporters of Cylon are killed. Later, though, the Athenians decided that was irreligious of the Archon to do, that he violated the gods themselves when he cut that string. And so the Alcmaeonids are temporarily exiled. And we'll talk about the Alcmaeonids again. They show up a couple times in Athenian history, but for a period of time following this attempted coup of Cylon, the Alcmaeonids are exiled. Okay. So after he fails, we then, in the following decades, we see two attempts by Athens to strengthen the state. The first one is by a guy named Draco. And we're told that Draco operated sometime around 620 BC. And his job, what the Athenians asked him to do, was to reform the Athenian law code. So there was an issue at this time that when there were disputes between people, that instead of going to the state and asking them to settle it, they would instead settle it between families, right? They would make private agreements, or they would go to the elders of their family. And so you'd have different kinds of law sort of being carried out by people instead of appealing to the authority of the state or considering that the state's job. And so this becomes an issue in things like murder. When someone got murdered in the ancient Greek world, the most likely response is that the victim's family would hunt down the murderer and kill them, or take revenge in some way, and it could lead to bloodshed and cycles of violence, which are disruptive to the state. And so Draco says, no, 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 the state is going to handle these criminal matters, and we're going to regulate even private cases about possession of property and things like that. And so his job is to put into effect a law code that will lay out the laws and what happens when you break them, and all of this stuff, so that there's a sort of settled law code everyone agrees to and abides by. We don't know much about this law code, though. We don't have a lot of the specifics because the law code itself is gone. The only thing we do know about it is that the punishment for pretty much every crime was death. Right? It was incredibly severe, to the point where in English we have a word, draconic, which means incredibly severe, right? Like punishments. So Draco wasn't particularly interested in really settling the tensions that existed in the city. His job was more about creating the state as a legal authority in the lives of the Athenian people. The one who starts to talk about these tensions and tries to settle them is Solon. So Solon is operating sometime in the 590s BC. He was approached by the Athenians, who saw him as a sort of a wise man, someone who they could ask for help. And they said, listen, there's a lot of strife in our city. There's a lot of resentment by the poor and the lower classes, and we're afraid it's going to lead to revolution or a tyrant. So what if we just made some reforms to the constitution and tried to prevent that? And Solon says, yes, I can do this. And so he sets out his own sort of constitution. It's known as the Solonian constitution, with changes that are meant to address these issues. So let's look at it issue by issue. So one of the big issues we have at this time is debt slavery, right? This is the practice of when tenant farmers cannot pay their rent, they will become debt slaves, and they can even be sold outside of the city. And so these men are known as hectomoroi, these tenant farmers, which means a sixth part, because their rent is 1/6 of all their produce. That's an incredible amount of stuff. And it often means they can't feed their own families if they have to pay this rent. So they do often go into debt and then into slavery. And it's a humongous issue burdening the Athenians. So what does Solon do? He banishes this practice, right? He outlaws it. Can no longer turn someone into a slave just because they fall into debt. Not only that, he cancels all existing debts. Right? He says any debts that are currently owed, they're gone. We're just going to wipe the slate clean at this point. He even goes as far as any men who have been sold as debt slaves outside of Athens, he tries to track them down and buy them back and return them to their homes. So he has truly abolished debt slavery as a practice, and he has tried to make it easier for these farmers by saying all debts are wiped clean right now. Everyone can try to get on top of their financial situation. All right, another issue that Athens has is that the Athenians have trouble producing enough agricultural goods to support themselves. The soil around Athens is pretty rocky. They don't have a nice plain like other parts of Greece do. And so it's hard for them to grow enough wheat and barley to feed their population. And so Solon understands this, and he puts in place a number of policies to encourage trade. For one thing, he says it's actually illegal to sell grain outside of Athens if you're an Athenian farmer. We have to keep all the grain we make here, but then we also need to export items so we can trade for more grain. And so he really encourages specifically olive oil production. Right? He encourages the planting of olive trees because Athenian soil is actually good for olive trees. They can grow fairly well. In that, and then he's establishing presses where people can convert their olives into olive oil, and that olive oil becomes a commodity that the Athenians can sell abroad and trade for grain, among other things. He also begins to encourage the pottery trade. pottery market at this point has really been cornered by Corinth, which has been producing this Proto-Corinthian pottery. And then there's also this black figure pottery we'll eventually talk about. But the Corinthian pottery is pretty dominant in the region, and Solon wants a piece of that. And so he encourages the pottery trade. Among other things, he encourages foreign artists to come settle in Athens because their work and their styles tend to be more popular than the native Athenian stuff at the time. And so by introducing these foreign artists to Athens, styles will improve and shift and create something that's more marketable. And so these foreign artists, they're invited to come to Athens, and they're given the status of medics. And we'll talk more about medics later, but the idea is you're not a native Athenian citizen, but you have some place in society, you have some status, you are a medic. And so that attracts some foreign artists to Athens. You also have the encouragement of adopting what's known as the Ubia Coin standard. Coin standards are a little weird because we don't use this system of coinage anymore. We use what's called fiat. But in the ancient world, a coin was made out of usually bronze or silver, and its value was just based on the amount of bronze or silver that was in that coin. And so if you have different standards, like maybe as a city you say, okay, I'm going to make coins that are 5 grams of silver, 10 grams of silver, and 15 grams of silver. If you go and trade with someone who decided their standard is, I have coins of 3 grams of silver, 6 grams of silver, and 9 grams of silver, it's hard for you to have any kind of transaction because your coinage doesn't easily match up. And so what Solon decides is we're going to use this Ubia coin standard. It's a popular one in the Aegean world and really the Mediterranean. And it's also the one that some of their rivals, their commercial rivals, do not use, right? So he has decided to sort of stand apart for them. And so by adopting this coinage standard, Athens can trade more easily with neighbors in the Mediterranean, and they can sort of try to edge out those who are not on this coin standard. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Like coin standards are weird and can be difficult to really grasp. Okay, so the other major issue, of course, at the time is that the aristocrats have all the power in the government. Okay, so the aristocrats are dominating the government. Only the eupatrids can enter the magistracies, only they can enter the Areopagus. So what is Solon going to do about it? There's a lot of resentment, especially because there's a kind of a new wealthy upper middle class also that's emerging, and they're especially resentful that they're like, well, we're wealthy, but we don't have power. That's ridiculous. So he creates a class system. He divides the Athenians into 4 classes based on how much wealth they have. The first one is the horribly named Pentecostiomedimnoi, right? This is the elite class. This is like your eupatrids, your hoiagathoi. Then you have your hippes. That's your upper middle class. This is like your new upper middle class of like wealthy merchants and any craftsmen who have made out really well. You've got your zeugatai. This is like your family farms and your craftsmen and stuff like that. They're your hoimes, or your firm middle class. And then you have your lower class. They're the thetes. Think about like your hoikakoi there. And he says, okay, so what we're going to do is, listen, the magistrates and the Areopagus stand, and only the wealthy eupatrids can join those. But he creates a new council of the 400. And their job is to prepare business for the Areopagus. And so they have an important function of directing what the Areopagus is going to talk about and what matters they're going to address. And anyone from these first 3 classes can join it. Every year they pick 400 men, probably by lot. They just pick them randomly from a list. And so they fill the council of the 400. But then we now have these sort of groups of men who previously did not have access to political power, who now do. The thetes still largely excluded. And these people, I should mention, they still aren't going to be magistrates. Oh, I'm sorry, the zeugatai are still not going to be magistrates. The hippes now are allowed to be. Okay, so power is not fully distributed, but it has been opened up, right? So now the magistrates and the Areopagus are drawn from the upper 2 classes, and this Council of 400 is drawn from the upper 3 classes. So more people are getting a say in the government. Okay, so there are some other things associated with Solon, but we're not going to go into every detail. But those are his major reforms. He's addressing a lot of the deep-seated issues that exist in Athens in the early Archaic period. His reforms ultimately are not successful, though, right? They seem good, they are good in a lot of ways, but the problem seems to be that people didn't think he went far enough, or at least, or sometimes too far. The very wealthy seem to have resented that they lost out on their monopolization of political power. They resented the canceling of debts, whereas the very poor resented that they were not given more political power, or that they were not given their land outright, for instance, which is something a lot of the poor were angling for. And so there's still a lot of resentment in the city of Athens, which is sort of prime territory, therefore, for a tyrant actually to rise. And we'll talk about that in our next video. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.